Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Consider a Chinese Buddhist monk named Yijing. He lived in the late 7th century, and he desperately wanted to learn Sanskrit.
Right, the ancient prestige language of Indian religious texts. He wanted to read the originals, completely unfiltered.
Exactly. So, where does he go to study? You might naturally assume he travels straight to the heart of India.
Yeah, that would make sense.
But he does not. Instead, he sails down to the jungle island of Sumatra in modern-day Indonesia. He sets up shop in a kingdom called Sriwijaya.
And he spends years there, right, deep in the rainforest, just mastering Sanskrit grammar.
He does. Today, as part of our Southeast Asian history series, you're going to find out exactly why a Chinese scholar went to an Indonesian island to learn an Indian language.
It completely upends how you might, think about borders and cultural diffusion.
Yeah.
You're conditioned to view history through a very specific lens.
Right, an army marches into a territory, a battle is fought, a flag is planted, and then a new culture is enforced from the top down.
Yeah, that is the Roman model, the imperial model. It is clean, binary, and usually violent. But the historical landscape of early Southeast Asia defies that entirely.
You are looking at a highly extensive history of Indian influence spreading across a massive geographical area. We're talking about Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar.
And this unfolds over a millennium, largely without a single Indian army marching in to conquer.
So the mission today is to uncover the mechanics of that peaceful integration. You need to understand how Indian culture, religious frameworks, and governance structures seamlessly wove themselves into Southeast Asian societies.
And more critically, you're going to see how local populations were not just passive sponges soaking up foreign ideas. They actively shaped and edited this synthesis for their own goals.
To do this, we are unpacking several types of sources for this deep dive. We have archaeological excavation reports, epigraphic studies, which is the study of ancient inscriptions, and genetic population data.
We also have the extensive historical analyses by scholars like George Coedes and O.W. Walters, people who spent their lives deciphering this puzzle.
But before charting the timeline of events, we must establish the lens through which historians view this cultural exchange. Because for a long time, the academic consensus was just, fundamentally flawed.
It really was. For most of the early 20th century, the study of this region was dominated by a theory known as Indianization.
That term was heavily popularized by the French scholar George Coedes, particularly in his work published in 1968.
Yes. And the framework of Indianization treated Southeast Asia as an empty vessel. It assumed the indigenous populations were essentially waiting for a superior Indian civilization to arrive and elevate them.
It frames the whole dynamic as a one-way street, a civilizing mission, which sounds exactly like 20th century European scholars taking their own colonial justifications and projecting them backward onto ancient history.
That is the core methodological flaw of the old theory. They looked at the massive stone temples in the jungle, read the Sanskrit carvings, and decided the locals could never have built them.
So they just assumed Indian colonists must have sailed over, subjugated the locals, and transplanted their society wholesale.
Exactly. And it completely stripped Southeast Asians of any historical agency. It created this rigid, false dichotomy. Scholars spent decades trying to separate what was purely local from what was purely Indian.
Which is a circular, frustrating search. You are looking for some primordial, untouched indigenous culture that never really existed in isolation.
Right. But as modern archaeology advanced and as anthropologists began to understand how early societies actually functioned, that colonial theory collapsed.
This brings the discussion to the modern counter-theory, which is known as localization. Scholars like O.W. Walters and Ian Mabbitt pioneered this shift.
Walters introduces this highly useful concept of the Southeast Asian man of prowess. Sometimes he's referred to simply as the big man.
To understand this, picture the political landscape of prehistoric Southeast Asia. You do not have sprawling nation-states. You have decentralized, kin-based villages.
And occasionally, a local leader emerges who possesses an extraordinary amount of what Walters called soul stuff. This is sort of innate, charismatic, spiritual authority.
People follow him because he is successful in battle or agriculture. But the fatal flaw of the big man system is its fragility.
Yes, that charismatic power is entirely personal. When that leader dies, the authority vanishes, the alliances break down, and the village splinters.
Because the son of the big man does not automatically inherit the soul stuff, these local rulers realize they hit a ceiling.
If you want to scale your power beyond your immediate relatives, if you want to tax distant trade routes, sheer charisma is not enough. You need an ideological framework and an administration.
Think of it like installing a new operating system. The old colonial Indianization theory assumed that a foreign tech monopoly sent in an army, held a sword to everyone's throat, and forced them to use their proprietary software.
But the localization theory suggests a completely different dynamic. The local Southeast Asian rulers willingly downloaded the Indian governance OS. They actively sought it out.
Because the software they were running, the kin-based big man system, kept crashing every time a leader died.
Exactly. The Indian model offered concepts of divine kingship. It offered administrative templates, and it offered a universal prestige language in Sanskrit. It was the perfect code to run a larger state.
What is fascinating here is how Wolters and Mabbott force you to reframe the entire geographical map in your head. Stop viewing India and Southeast Asia as two isolated landmasses separated by a void.
Right, they were contiguous parts of a single, highly active maritime world. Wolters observed that Indian culture did not arrive as a monolithic dictate. It arrived as news.
It came via the daily interactions of merchants and sailors. Southeast Asian leaders received this news and recognized they were part of a much wider economic globe.
And they strategically utilized the foreign vocabulary to solve their own local domestic problems. Wolters described the end result of this process with a very evocative phrase.
Foreign materials fading into local statements.
Yes, you take the foreign code, but you write a local program with it.
So, you have the motivation. The local rulers want the upgrade, but you cannot download an ideology over Wi-Fi in the year 200 BCE.
No, ideas require physical vectors. They require ships, navigators, and profound economic incentives. You have to look at the mechanics of the early maritime trade network.
We need to understand how the physical connection was made and sustained. The Austronesian Maritime Trade Network established contact with southern India and Sri Lanka as early as 500 BCE.
And the physical reality of this exchange is bound to the environment, specifically the monsoon winds. The massive trade network spanning the Indian Ocean was dictated entirely by the cyclical nature of the monsoons.
You have the northeast monsoon dominating one half of the year, pushing weather patterns in one direction, and the southwest monsoon dominating the other half.
Which means a ship cannot just sail from the Coromandel coast of India to the Malay Peninsula, drop off a cargo of cotton, and sail back the next day.
They physically could not. The wind would be blowing entirely against them.
Right. If you are a merchant in this era, you ride the wind to a Southeast Asian port. Once you arrive, you are marooned there. You have to literally wait 4 to 6 months for the seasons to shift.
Put yourself in the shoes of that merchant. You are stuck in a port city in the Isthmus of Kra for half a year. What do? You do not just sit on your boat.
You rent a house. You build a warehouse. You learn the local language to negotiate better prices for camphor and sandalwood. You marry a local woman and set up a shrine to your gods.
You become part of the fabric of the city. Geography forces these bottlenecks of human interaction. The Isthmus of Kra is the narrowest point of the Malay Peninsula.
Sailing all the way south around the peninsula was long and fraught with the danger of piracy, so merchants would often arrive at the western coast of the isthmus and offload their cargo.
They would carry it overland through the jungle passes and load it onto new ships on the eastern coast facing the Gulf of Thailand.
You see similar arteries of intense interaction at the Three Pagodas Pass, connecting Myanmar to Thailand, and down through the Strait of Malacca.
The physical artifacts pulled from the earth confirm this massive web of interaction. If you look at the excavation reports from Iron Age sites, places like the ancient port city of Oc Eo in Vietnam or Khao Sam Keo in Thailand.
Archaeologists are finding notable things. They are digging up Indian rouletted ware, which is a specific type of fine decorated pottery, and they are finding carnelian beads and etched agate from South Asia.
These are high-status prestige goods buried in the graves of local Southeast Asian elites. But it is more than just pottery and jewelry. The genetic data provides a map of human intimacy.
Genetic sequencing offers a window into the past that artifacts alone cannot. Geneticists analyzing modern populations have focused heavily on a specific Y chromosome haplogroup known as OM95.
This genetic marker is widely shared among Austroasiatic speakers, right?
It is. When researchers run genome-wide SNP analyses, looking at millions of tiny variations across the genome, they find a consistent baseline. Across mainland Southeast Asia, there is roughly a 1 to 5% South Asian admixture.
But the data does not stay flat. There are massive spikes depending on the geography.
Exactly. In certain southern Thai samples, that South Asian admixture jumps up to 35%. Because the studies focus heavily on Y chromosome data passed from father to son, it points directly to male-mediated gene flow.
It translates to Indian male merchants and sailors arriving in these port cities, settling down and intermarrying with local women.
And raising families over successive generations. Think about what that 35% means over 1,000 years. It is not the genetic footprint of an invading army.
It is the footprint of 1,000 ancient, mundane domestic lives. It is the signature of peaceful, persistent integration. But here, you have to dismantle a long-standing historical bias.
Right, the traditional assumption was that the Indian merchants were the sole navigators, bravely crossing the ocean to reach the passive Southeast Asians.
That is entirely false. The seafaring technology of the Austronesian peoples, the indigenous populations of maritime Southeast Asia, was arguably superior.
The Austronesian expansion is a massive maritime migration. Long before the Indian merchant guilds organized expeditions, Austronesian sailors were already utilizing advanced outrigger canoe technology.
An outrigger provides massive stability in open ocean swells, preventing the narrow hull from capsizing. They understood celestial navigation and wave patterns.
They initiated the early contacts. They were sailing across the Bay of Bengal to Sri Lanka and southern India to trade gold, spices, and exotic forest products. It was a bilateral exchange.
The economic incentives were massive on both sides. As the volume of trade increased, the casual voyages transformed. You see the rise of highly organized, incredibly wealthy merchant guilds.
These guilds, operating out of regions like Gujarat and the Coromandel Coast, functioned like ancient multinational corporations. They had the capital to fund fleets.
And crucially, they did not just bring sailors and cargo. They brought specialized personnel. They brought Brahmin priests, Buddhist monks, and scribes.
The presence of those scribes shifts the entire trajectory of Southeast Asian history. Trade generates wealth, but wealth generates complexity.
If a local Southeast Asian ruler is suddenly managing massive warehouses of imported textiles and levying taxes, he runs into a massive logistical hurdle.
You cannot manage a complex, multi-ethnic trade hub using only human memory and oral agreements. You need a technology to record, store, and transmit information. You need writing.
Which brings up the next critical phase, the peaceful spread of scripts and the Sanskrit language. Before this contact, Southeast Asia was primarily an oral culture.
There were no indigenous writing systems, so they imported the technology. The specific software they downloaded was primarily the late Southern Brahmi and the Pallava script from southern India.
The transition from an oral society to a literate society is a profound leap. The earliest physical evidence is deeply illuminating.
Archaeologists point to the Vocan inscription, located in central Vietnam. That dates all the way back to the 4th century. Another critical find is the Mulavarman inscriptions.
Those are carved into 7 stone pillars, known as yupas, which were used as sacrificial posts, right?
Yes, found deep in the tropical forests of Kalimantan on the island of Borneo, dating to the early 5th century. You are looking at massive stone pillars erected in a Borneo jungle, and the text is entirely in Sanskrit.
It is the ultimate proof of the localization process. But the scripts did not stay static. Just as software is constantly modified for different hardware, the imported scripts began to mutate.
They had to mutate. Sanskrit and the local Austronesian languages have entirely different phonetic structures. They contain different sounds.
Over the centuries, the local scribes modified the Pallava script to better fit their native tongues. In Java, this evolution produced the Kawi script.
On the mainland, it evolved into the Khmer script of Cambodia, the ancestor of the modern Thai script, and the highly distinct Pew script in central Myanmar.
There is a phenomenon here that historians call dysgraphy. Wait, so they were writing in 2 entirely different scripts on the exact same piece of stone.
They were. It is a fascinating indicator of a society straddling 2 worlds. Archaeologists find monuments where the local Pew language is carved, using the local Pew script, but immediately adjacent to it are passages of Pali or Sanskrit.
Written in a formal, imported Brahmi script. Who is that even for? Are they translating for the local farmers, or is it purely a status symbol?
It serves a dual purpose, very similar to historical monuments in Europe that feature both the local vernacular and formal Latin. The local script communicates practical information to the literate class of the immediate area.
And the Sanskrit or Pali script serves a cosmic, religious, and diplomatic function. It connects the local ruler to the broader prestige culture of the Indian Ocean world.
Sanskrit became the ultimate operating language for diplomacy and elite governance. It provided a universal vocabulary for abstract, complex concepts that local languages might not have had words for yet.
You can still hear the echoes of this ancient code in modern Southeast Asian languages today. If you go to the Philippines and listen to Tagalog, you hear the word guro for teacher.
And muka for face. or Bathala for a supreme deity, which derives directly from the Sanskrit term patara.
If you listen to Indonesian, foundational concepts like dharma, representing cosmic duty, and karma are pure Sanskrit imports.
This raises an important question, though. The adoption of this literacy was not just an aesthetic choice, it was the bedrock of state formation. You want to scale a kingdom, you must standardize the law.
The importation of the scripts allowed Southeast Asian rulers to import the Dharmasastras, the ancient Indian treatises on jurisprudence and statecraft.
Literacy allowed a king to issue a royal decree, have it carved into stone or inscribed on copper plates, and physically transported hundreds of miles away to a border province.
It allowed for the rigid codification of religious rituals. The massive centralized empires that eventually dominated the region would have been administratively impossible without writing.
So if you are a local ruler, you have acquired the economic wealth for maritime trade, you have downloaded the writing system to handle taxation, you have imported the legal treatises.
But there is one final crucial piece missing. You need to legitimize your immense new power on a cosmic level. You need to convince your subjects that your right to rule is mandated by the universe itself.
You use Indian religious concepts to elevate your status to the divine. You create the Devaraja cult.
The Devaraja, which translates directly to the god-king cult, it represents the absolute zenith of ideological synthesis.
To see it in action, you look to the year 802 on the forested plateau of Mahendraparvata in Cambodia. A ruler named Jayavarman II initiates a massive consecration ritual.
He gathers Brahmin priests who utilize Sanskrit incantations to perform a ceremony that officially declares him a universal monarch.
But it is not a pure importation of Indian Hinduism. He fuses Shivite theology, which identifies the king as the living earthly manifestation of Shiva, with the ancient Southeast Asian practice of ancestor veneration.
It is a brilliant political maneuver. The indigenous belief system holds that the spirits of deceased ancestors dwell in the mountains and protect the land.
Jayavarman II takes that local framework and updates the UI. He says, I am not merely descended from the ancestors, I am the embodiment of Shiva.
It creates an unbreakable loop of legitimacy. To challenge the king is no longer just treason, it is cosmic heresy. And this divine status was structured around the Mandala Nagara political model.
You have to discard the modern conceptualization of a nation-state here. Modern countries have hard-surveyed borders with fences.
The political geography of ancient Southeast Asia operated like a light source in a dark room. The light is blindingly bright at the center where the god-king resides.
But as you move further away, the light gradually fades into shadow. Power was fluid, radiating outward, resulting in highly porous frontiers.
A king measured his might by counting how many subordinate rulers were drawn into his orbit to pay tribute, not by square mileage.
And the visual evidence of this religious and political blending is everywhere. Look at the Tum Phra Phothisat relief, a rock-cut carving found in a cave in central Thailand.
It depicts the Buddha seated, serenely preaching the cosmic law of Dharma. But seated below him, actively gesturing in submission and reverence, are the supreme Hindu deities Shiva and Vishnu.
You are looking at a society actively negotiating the hierarchy of different imported software packages, blending Buddhism and Hinduism together on a single cave wall.
And they wove them seamlessly into the local animist fabric. In Thailand, the belief in local animist spirits, known as Phai, did not disappear when Hinduism and Buddhism arrived.
The Phai, which inhabit trees and rivers, were simply integrated alongside the imported Hindu-Buddhist deities known as the Thawada.
You find a similarly intricate integration on the island of Bali. The Balinese developed a unique system called the Pura, or temple system.
Orthodox text-based Hinduism completely merged with the ancient worship of specific hill and water spirits. The Balinese even downloaded the Indian caste system, but modified it to fit their demographic reality.
In India, the caste system is vast and immensely complex. In Bali, they adopted the Trivamsa, representing the three highest castes: the priests, the nobles, and the merchants.
But the Trivamsa only constitutes about 7% of the Balinese population. The other 93% belong to the commoner class.
They took a foreign social hierarchy and localized it so it respected the existing spiritual and social geography. But pause for a second. When you talk about Sanskrit decrees and cosmic hierarchies, it sounds incredibly top-heavy.
It does.
If you are an average rice farmer in the 9th century living a week's walk from the capital, do you actually care about any of this? Is this purely an elite phenomenon?
That is the essential question regarding the reach of the state. In terms of literacy and high theology, this was absolutely the domain of the elite. The farmer in the field was not debating Sanskrit grammar,
Right?
but the ideology profoundly impacted the daily life of every single commoner through the physical manipulation of the landscape.
Because the concept of the God King provided the ultimate justification for the mobilization of massive amounts of human labor. This is the era of monumental architecture and hydraulic engineering.
You cannot talk about the God King without talking about the water. Look at the capital city of Angkor in the Khmer Empire. They built structures called barays.
These were not just large ponds, they were colossal artificial reservoirs. Some measured several miles long and over a mile wide.
Constructed entirely by human hands, moving millions of cubic meters of earth. The barays were designed to capture the torrential downpours of the monsoon season.
They stored the water and systematically irrigated the surrounding rice fields during the dry season. That is how the theology reaches the farmer.
Exactly. The farmer might not comprehend the Sanskrit liturgy, but their survival depends entirely on the irrigation network managed by the temple complex.
The religious ideology justifies the absolute power of the king. The king uses that power to organize tens of thousands of laborers. The laborers build the hydraulic infrastructure.
The infrastructure guarantees the agricultural surplus. The surplus feeds the massive population and funds the construction of even more temples. It is a closed, perfectly functioning loop.
This immense agricultural and commercial wealth fueled the rise of what historians refer to as the empires of the Indosphere. Let's walk through the timeline of these major polities.
The early prototypes established the blueprint. In the Mekong Delta, spanning the 1st to the 6th centuries, you have the Kingdom of Funan.
Funan derived its immense wealth directly from controlling the port city of Ak-Io. Ak-Io was a critical node where the maritime trade routes converged.
Archaeologists have even found Roman gold coins in Ak-Io, demonstrating the staggering reach of this early globalized network. Concurrently, in central Myanmar, the PU city-states flourish. Cities like Triksetra.
Strixetra is notable because it shows how quickly different software packages were adopted. The Pew people embraced Theravada Buddhism incredibly early.
This was a direct downstream result of the missionary monks dispatched by the great Indian Emperor Ashoka all the way back in the 3rd century BCE.
The Pew manifested this belief by constructing massive, towering, cylindrical brick stupas that entirely dominated the floodplains.
But the geopolitical dynamics shift dramatically when you turn your attention from the mainland agrarian empires to the maritime empires. In the 7th century, the Srivijaya Empire rises to power.
Based on the island of Sumatra, Srivijaya was a textbook thalassocracy. Let's unpack that term. A thalassocracy is not an empire of land, it is an empire of water.
You do not care about conquering vast tracts of deep jungle. You care about controlling the choke points. Srivijaya controlled the Strait of Malacca and the Sunda Strait.
They essentially built a heavily armed toll booth on the single most lucrative trade route in the world. If a ship wanted to move spices to India or silk to the Middle East, they had to sail through Srivijayan waters.
And stop at a Srivijayan port and pay a massive tax. They funneled that commercial wealth into religious patronage. Srivijaya became one of the preeminent global centers for Mahayana Buddhism.
This brings us back to the Chinese monk Yu Jing, whom we discussed at the very beginning. When Yu Jing arrived in the Srivijayan capital in the 670s, he recorded that there were over 1,000 Buddhist scholars living there.
The level of Sanskrit scholarship was so rigorous that he advised other Chinese monks to spend a year or two in Sumatra to perfect their grammar before even attempting to travel to India.
Srivijaya was not a cultural backwater passively receiving instructions. It was a primary intellectual hub producing its own localized version of Buddhist theology.
And eventually, this wealth manifests in stone. The physical legacies of this era remain some of the most monumental structures on the planet.
In the 8th and 9th centuries, on the neighboring island of Java, the Selendra dynasty channels their wealth into the construction of Borobudur.
Borobudur is an architectural marvel, built atop a natural hill requiring over 2 million cubic feet of volcanic stone. It is designed as a massive, three-dimensional physical mandala.
As a pilgrim walks up the successive terraces, passing thousands of intricate relief carvings, they are physically and metaphorically ascending from the earthly realm of desire up to ultimate enlightenment.
And on the mainland, in the 12th century, the Khmer Empire unleashes its resources to build Angkor Wat. It is the peak of the Devaraja cult's capacity to coordinate human labor and architectural vision.
It was built as the state temple in the capital city, originally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. The central towers mimic the peaks of Mount Meru, the mythical home of the gods.
They took Dravidian-style architectural elements from southern India and executed them with a distinctly local Khmer aesthetic. But it is crucial to understand that cultural integration is not just about moving massive stones.
True integration happens in the narrative space. It shapes the stories mothers tell their children, the plays performed in the village squares, and the moral framework of the society.
This is where the localization process is most vibrant. The Indian Ocean trade networks did not just bring spices and scripts. They brought the great Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
These are sprawling, massive narratives featuring gods, demons, magical weapons, and agonizing moral dilemmas. But they were not treated as rigid religious dogma.
The locals utilized them as dynamic handbooks for political ideology and moral instruction, teaching the complex concepts of dharma and karma.
The regional adaptations of these epics prove that the Southeast Asians were actively rewriting the software's user interface. In Thailand, the Ramayana is adapted into the Ramakien.
In the Khmer Empire of Cambodia, it becomes the Reamker. And on the Indonesian islands of Java and Bali, the Mahabharata becomes the foundational text for Wayang Kulit, the tradition of shadow puppetry.
If you look closely at these adaptations, you see the mechanics of localization. They did not just translate the Sanskrit word for word, they modified the text to fit their own physical landscape.
In the Thai Ramakien, the geography is shifted to resemble the rivers and mountains of Thailand. The heroes use local Southeast Asian armaments.
Hanuman, the monkey god, takes on a significantly expanded, more cunning and localized personality. The moral emphasis also shifts.
The core themes remain intact: the battle between good and evil, the struggle for rightful succession. But the behavioral nuances are adjusted to resonate with Southeast Asian ideals of heroic conduct and kingly obligation.
The epics were performed in the royal courts as high statecraft. When a Khmer king watched a performance, he was viewing a mirror of his own supposed divine lineage.
It was publicly reinforcing his absolute duty to maintain order against the forces of chaos, represented by the demons on the stage.
It is like adapting a highly successful narrative format for a domestic audience. You retain the core dramatic engine, but entirely change the costumes, the settings, and the vernacular, so the audience feels the story belongs to them.
So, for centuries, you have this incredible era of peaceful, highly profitable cultural integration. Massive temples are rising, and localized epics are being recited. But history does not remain static.
Systems break down. The era of peaceful diffusion eventually faced violent disruptions and profound religious transformations. This forces a look at the Chola invasion and the arrival of Islam.
Throughout this entire discussion, the emphasis has been on the lack of military coercion. However, there is one glaring, massively destructive exception. In the year 1025, the Chola dynasty launches an assault across the Bay of Bengal.
The Chola dynasty is a highly aggressive maritime empire based in southern India, ruled by Rajendra Chola. After centuries of peaceful trade, what provokes a king to assemble an armada and strike Srivijaya?
The motivation was purely economic. The Srivijaya Empire had simply become too successful. Their control over the Strait of Malacca had evolved from a reasonable toll booth into an extortionate monopoly.
They were demanding exorbitant fees from every ship passing through to China. The powerful merchant guilds of the Chola Empire were seeing their profit margins decimated.
So Rajendra Chola does not send diplomats, he sends the navy. They execute a series of highly coordinated, devastating strikes against the primary Srivijayan port cities in Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula.
They sack the capital, plunder the accumulated wealth of centuries of trade, and capture the Srivijayan king. It was a targeted strike designed to shatter the trade monopoly.
But the crucial point is what happens next. They do not stay to sweep up the glass. They do not leave occupation forces or annex Sumatra. They grab the loot and sail home on the next monsoon wind.
The attack crippled Srivijaya, but it did not fundamentally alter the underlying cultural matrix of the region. However, the decline of these ancient maritime empires coincided with a much deeper transformation.
Between the 13th and 15th centuries, you see the arrival of Islam.
This is a fascinating pivot point. Given how deeply entrenched the Hindu, Buddhist, and animist cosmologies were, how does Islam successfully integrate into this landscape?
It integrates by utilizing the exact same physical and cultural vectors that brought the earlier Indian influences. Islam did not sweep through via massive Arab armies marching out of the Middle East.
It arrived on the decks of merchant ships, riding the monsoon winds. But crucially, it was brought largely by Indian Muslim traders operating out of Gujarat and the Coromandel coast.
Which means the code had already been localized once before it even arrived. The form of Islam brought by these merchants had already spent centuries interacting with the Indian subcontinent.
It was heavily influenced by Sufism, which is a more mystical, highly adaptable approach to the Islamic faith.
Because of this Sufi influence, the Islam that arrived in the port cities of Southeast Asia possessed the flexibility to merge syncretically with the existing societies.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the earlier Hindu, Buddhist, and animist traditions were not eradicated. They were softly absorbed and repurposed.
Hindu-Buddhist kings converted to Islam to secure highly lucrative trade alliances with the wealthy Gujarati Muslim merchants. But they retained their ancient courtly traditions.
You could have a Muslim sultan ruling an Islamic trading state in Java. He prays at the mosque on Friday. But his coronation ceremony might still feature Hindu motifs and Sanskrit chanting.
The local shadow puppet theater continued to perform the tales of the Mahabharata, sometimes subtly reinterpreting the ancient Indian heroes as champions of Islamic moral values.
It proves the undeniable resilience of the localization process. The Southeast Asian societies possessed a genius for absorption. They could take entirely foreign systems, strip them for parts, and rebuild them to perfectly fit the local environment.
They ensured that nothing of value was ever truly lost, only constantly transformed into a deeper synthesis.
Which leaves you with a profound thought. If you look at the modern nations of Southeast Asia today, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, they are fiercely independent states navigating contemporary nationalism.
Yet their languages, the architecture of their state buildings, and their traditional arts all carry the indelible DNA of a thousand-year-long dialogue with India.
It challenges you to look at your own world. If human culture is a continuous, unending process of localizing the foreign, you have to ask yourself something. What external, globalized technologies or ideologies that you are downloading today might be considered deeply and traditionally local 1,000 years from now?
When historians of the future dig through the digital and physical layers of our modern society, they're not going to find clean, rigid boundaries. They will just find the water and the wind blending the layers together.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.